Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. So let's start actually with the eternal law. That's where Thomas starts in this question 91. He asks whether there's an eternal law. And eternal means what? Lasting forever, right? But eternal actually means something beyond forever. If something exists in eternity, that means that it exists at all times and places. As a matter of fact, even before time began, it would be there. And when you get down to it, if you ask Thomas, well, what's the eternal law? Ultimately, it is God. God is not something different than the law or the reason or the structure that he gives to things. So it's not like, God one day said, people are screwing around too much. I need to make a law. I'm going to make a law and it's going to stick for good because I'm God. It's not that kind of eternal law. I mean, that's a sort of popular or bowdlerized version of how things take place in the Bible anyway, but that's not how Thomas thinks they take place. There's a sort of structure within God's mind that orients everything, that understands everything to the good, which, again, for Thomas is ultimately what? God. And that's there before even the world is created. So when the world is created, Thomas thinks that other things are kind of built into it based on this. Now this is a pretty lofty idea, isn't it? We don't actually get to see the eternal law as such. Who actually fully understands the eternal law and gets to see it all the time? Who do you think? If not us, well, just God, right? But we can grasp part of it. We can't grasp, Thomas says, we can't grasp the totality of it. He says even the blessed in heaven, they don't actually see every single thing. But, they're better off than those of us who are struggling down here trying to make sense of things. So we can grasp this in part. And Thomas thinks that the distinctive way in which we human beings do this is through the natural law. So this is what is really proper to us. Don't we have some sort of ends built into the fabric of our distinctive way of being? Thomas says yes. So that's where we get to the natural law. So let's look at this question now, after all that long discussion, whether there is a natural law. He says, we can say that there is a natural law, in part because, he says, all things are subject to divine providence, and they're ruled and measured by the eternal law. So all these things partake of it as they have these respective inclinations. Do we have inclinations? Do we have certain basic drives? And we're going to look at some of these in a little bit more detail. Yeah, we do have certain basic drives. Do we have certain distinctive acts, certain things that human beings do that are distinctive to us as a species? What would you say those are? Yeah.
It's like overcognitive abilities, like being able to reason and think.
Yeah, and do apes do some of that sort of stuff, or dolphins? Yeah, to some extent, but nothing like us. When an ape builds a supercomputer, then maybe we'll start, taking that seriously and saying, when dolphins, which, have this gigantic brain, most of that brain is actually devoted to sonar, it turns out. So if sonar was actually some way in which you could build technology and communicate with each other and build a whole society, maybe we take it a bit more seriously that they're sort of our rivals with this. But yeah, you're right, our cognitive abilities. What else do we do that's distinctive to us that animals don't do, except in cartoons? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, animals do communicate with each other, but their range of communication is much more limited than ours is. I mean, no animal actually asks about language. You know, animals aren't bilingual either. It's not like an animal says, you know, it's not like a dog says, I need to learn what those cats are saying over there because I think they're talking about me. I better learn some cat language. It just doesn't happen. It wouldn't occur to them to do that. So language is a key thing. What else? Are there other things that we do that are really distinctively human? These are great things. Thomas would love to hear language, rationality, cognitive abilities. But are there other things that set us apart? It's sometimes interesting to think about those too. I'll get you started. I actually brought this up in a lecture I gave up at the culinary earlier this week. We're the only animal that cooks. I mean, there are some animals that do modify their food in certain ways so that they can take it in better. You know, flies, for example, do their digestion actually in large part outside of their body, which is kind of gross, frankly speaking. But, you know, what they're doing is kind of cooking the food, but they're not actually like getting out, you know, a pot or a pan and slicing things up and mixing ingredients together and saying, how can I make this taste better? We do that, don't we? That's distinctive human behavior. I guess you could ask, could you teach a chimpanzee to cook? I suppose, you know. Maybe they could get a taste for certain things. I like ginger in this. But that's us. What else? What are other things that are just totally distinctively human?
Well, all of our things like going to school, getting married,
Oh.
traditions that
Yeah.
animals would never do.
Okay, that's a lot of stuff right there.
Yeah.
Going to school, and this ties into those cognitive abilities. We have to develop those, and that's made possible because of speech. So going to school, getting married. I mean, there are animals that do mate for life, but they don't have a ceremony for that, do they? With this ring I thee wed, you know, my beautiful mockingbird wife, or something like that. They don't do that. Yeah.
You can also say like clothing ourselves.
Yes. Bless you. And again, can you turn animals onto that sort of thing? Yeah. I mean, you could get a chimpanzee, and they're very curious, and they might like getting dressed up, but they don't actually do that in the wild, do they? We actually impose it on a lot of animals that don't like it, like cats and dogs. Cats and dogs don't really like being dressed up, but we make them do it anyway, especially when they're kids. I remember we used to shove my dog into a pair of shorts. What was the third thing that you said? So
I just said any traditions that we have.
traditions, yes, we have culture. And again, if we look at the higher apes, they do have bands in which certain things get passed on and become kind of traditions. But I mean, that's integral to us. And humans have been doing that for a very long time.
I was going to say music and religion.
Yes, religion. You don't find animals, let's say we take very sort of early types of religion, involving, say, some sort of cult with sacrifices and a statue that's supposed to represent some sort of deity. You don't find dogs doing that. You don't find lions, who are the top of their food chain, doing that. You don't find dolphins doing that. You only find human beings doing that. Only human beings bury their dead with things. Well, I mean, most animals don't even bury the dead anyway. But we very early on bury the dead with things. That shows the existence of beliefs in an afterlife, like flowers or possessions. Bury them in certain ways, like in a fetal position or in a laid out position. We are symbolic creatures. So that is part of our our inclinations. These are things that children play at. These are things that are part of the fabric of who we are. It's not just our higher cognitive abilities, and those are really important. It's also these things like passing on traditions, like cooking, like religion. You could probably say we're also the only animal who truly laughs, who engages in things to try to make each other laugh. I mean, hyenas make it sound like laughter, but it's not actually laughing, even though the cartoons, try to make it seem like that. So that's all, in some way, part of the fabric of who we are, of what we are, the kind of beings we are. So the natural law is going to be connected with this. And he says, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence, the eternal law, in the most excellent way. How so? We actually, like Thomas says, partake of a share of providence. And again, this is a theologically informed perspective, right? Thomas sees us as being above the other animals, not just by having these greater abilities, but by being made part of the process. Having what we do made part of the process. Sort of, we get to be in the entry-level positions in the divine bureaucracy, you might say, right? Starting out in the mail, or wherever else you have to start out. But we get to be parts of it. How are we provident? Both for itself, one's own being, and for others. So it says, wherefore it is a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination, its proper end and act. So our natural inclinations are not just to preserve our own lives or to make ourselves happy or something like that. They're also, provided we haven't gotten screwed up in the process, they're also for others. They're also directed towards others. That's distinctively human too. It's interesting, they've done these nature films, and they've found like water buffaloes, they don't actually always abandon the one that got chased by the lions and attacked. Sometimes they'll come in and they'll attack the lions and save it. But we do that sort of thing fairly routinely. So, we do have a natural law. Now what we want to do is we want to clarify these other kinds of law that Thomas talks about. The natural law tells us to do certain things, but it's very general. So it's not like law out there, like the law that governs speeding on Route 9. It governs speeding pretty much everywhere else, right? If you speed and you get caught, you get a certain kind of ticket. It's all determined by law. It's made public. It's there to preserve the common good. Natural law is a lot more general. So then we get to what he calls human law. And this is the kind of law that we're used to thinking about. The actual determinate laws in our society. And these can be more or less well made, more or less well put together. I mean, have any of you ever run into a law that you think is unjust or unfair? Never? People, complain about laws all the time.
What do you mean, like laws like just created by our government, or laws like around
By governments. Human law, where he's talking about that, these are laws actually created by some sort of governing body. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a democratic government. You could have a dictatorship, and that has its own kind of laws. The communists have their own kind of laws.
Would you count like rules or whatever set by like schools?
Yeah.
Like I know at my high school I had a really strict like uniform policy.
Okay.
So like we all had to wear. I went to Catholic school, so we wore uniforms. But like one stupid thing that we weren't allowed to do is wear earrings like bigger than a quarter. Like I don't know what that was supposed to do at all.
Yeah, how they fixed on that. Yeah.
But that was one of the stupid. Would that count underneath?
Yeah, and how would you measure whether that's a good law or rule or not? You would compare it to what its purposes are, and what it actually accomplishes. If the law tends to just aggravate everybody, it's probably not a good law or a good rule. Sometimes people actually create laws just so they can have power over other people, or make their lives miserable. I mean, that's not usually the case, thank God, but it happens, right? Some laws are created just to enforce inequalities. I brought up Martin Luther King a couple times this semester. Martin Luther King refers in his letter from a Birmingham jail to Thomas Aquinas, and this notion of human laws having to be tested in accordance with some sort of criteria that comes from the natural law.